The morning my wife filed for divorce, I was the last one in the family to know what was actually happening. I remember sitting in the kitchen before we left for the courthouse, drinking coffee I didn't taste, watching my 8-year-old daughter Lily eat cereal and stare quietly at the table. She had her small backpack with her, the one with the yellow stars on it, and inside it, tucked next to her pencil case, was a tablet I'd seen her carry 100 times before. I didn't think anything of it. My name is Gerald. I'm 61 years old, and that Tuesday morning in November, I walked into a family courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, believing I understood what was happening to me. I thought this was a painful but ordinary divorce, a marriage that had worn itself down. I thought I was there to negotiate and eventually move on. I was wrong about almost everything. My wife, Carol, had been the one to initiate everything. We'd been married 16 years. We had Lily, and we had a house in a suburb just east of the city, and a life that looked, from the outside, entirely stable. I worked in supply chain management for a manufacturing firm. Carol ran a home goods shop she'd opened about 4 years into our marriage. I'd helped her get the business loan. I'd co-signed without hesitation. The courthouse smelled like recycled air and old carpet. I sat in a hard wooden chair on my side of the room, my hands folded on my knees, and I listened to Carol's attorney describe our marriage in a way that felt like hearing about two people I'd never met. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He talked about emotional absence. He talked about my work schedule, the long hours, the quarterly travel, the times I'd come home late or taken calls on weekends. He made it sound like I had been a man living in a house with a family the way someone lives near a restaurant they never visit. And some of it, if I'm being honest, wasn't entirely wrong. I had worked long hours. I had missed things. A school concert once. A parent-teacher meeting I'd had to reschedule. These were real. But the way he framed them, carefully, deliberately, made the whole 16 years of our marriage sound like one long act of neglect. Carol sat across the aisle with her attorney. She wore a dark blue blazer I hadn't seen before. Her posture was straight. She wasn't crying. I remember noticing that. I had expected that she might be upset, that ending something this long would show on her face somehow. But she looked composed in a way that didn't feel like strength. It felt more like someone who had already moved on from a place before they officially left it. Every time I glanced over at her, she looked down at the table or at her attorney's notes. Not once did she meet my eyes. Lily sat in the gallery between a court services worker and me. She was wearing her dark green jacket, the one she called her important jacket because she wore it to school events. She had her stuffed dog, Bruno, on her lap and her backpack at her feet. She was quiet in the way children get when they're absorbing something they don't entirely understand but can feel isn't right. Every few minutes she looked up at me. Not the way kids look at parents when they're scared and want reassurance. The way she looked at me was different, like she was checking on something, like she was making sure I was still there. I didn't know what to make of it at the time. Carol's attorney continued. He said I had shown, quote, a consistent and documented pattern of prioritizing professional obligations over the emotional and developmental needs of the child. He said Carol had effectively been a single parent for much of Lily's life. He said I was rarely present for homework, for bedtime, for the small daily moments that form a child's sense of being loved and seen. I sat very still and let him finish. I wanted to say, I help with homework 3 nights a week. I coached Lily's soccer team for 2 seasons. I was home for dinner most nights. I called when I was traveling. I knew the names of her 3 best friends, her teacher, her favorite book, the song she had been humming for the past month. But I didn't say any of it. I'd been told to let the process work. My attorney, a quiet man named Paul, had said to stay calm and wait for our turn. So I waited. What I didn't know, what no one in that room except Lily knew, was that she had something in that backpack. She'd been carrying it for weeks. I've thought a lot about when things started to change with Carol. Not the marriage itself. That's a longer, slower story. But the specific shift. The point where something became different in a way I couldn't name at the time. I'd put it at around 8 months before that courthouse morning. It was gradual enough that I kept finding explanations for it. That's the thing about trusting someone completely. You're not looking for problems. You're not cataloging small inconsistencies. You're just living your life, assuming the person next to you is living theirs in the same general direction. Carol had always been social. She had friends from the shop, a few women she'd known since before we were married, her younger sister Dana, who called regularly. Conversations in our house were normal background noise. I was used to hearing her laugh in the next room, hearing her end a call with "okay, love you," by the way she always did. But around 8 months out, that changed. Not dramatically, just quietly. Phone calls started happening in the bedroom with the door pulled most of the way shut. When I came downstairs in the morning, she'd sometimes be at the kitchen table with her laptop, and she'd close it, not slam it, just ease it shut when she heard me on the stairs. When I asked about it, she'd say it was supplier stuff, inventory, she was dealing with a vendor issue, nothing interesting. I believed her. I had no reason not to. There was one evening in particular. I'd come back from a 3-day trip to a plant we were auditing in Michigan. It was a Wednesday. I remember because Lily had gymnastics on Wednesdays and Carol was supposed to have picked her up, but when I walked through the door the house was quiet. Carol was in the kitchen. She was on the phone, standing with her back to the door, speaking in a voice just above a whisper. When she heard me set my bag down, she turned around, and something crossed her face. I call it adjustment, the way a person's expression adjusts when they realize they've been seen. And then she said, louder, into the phone, "Yeah, just ship it with the others. I'll sort out the invoice when it comes in." She hung up and smiled at me. "How was the drive?" "Fine," I said. "Where's Lily?" "Dana picked her up. I had a late call." That was all. We moved on. I unpacked. We had dinner. Lily told me about the new vault she was trying to learn. The evening was ordinary. But I thought about that moment later, and I thought about it again in the weeks that followed, because it wasn't the only one. There were others like it. Small recalibrations. Conversations that ended when I walked in. A weekend trip Carol took with her sister to visit a college friend. She'd been on trips like that before. It wasn't unusual, but this one she mentioned almost as a footnote, 2 days before she left, when usually she'd have talked about it for a week. Lily noticed things too. Children notice more than we think, and they notice differently. They don't construct theories the way adults do. They just feel when the temperature in a room has changed. About 5 months before the filing, I was sitting with Lily at the kitchen table helping her with a reading assignment. She was supposed to identify the main character's problem in a short story. We'd gone through it twice. Then she set her pencil down and looked at me in that careful way she had. "Dad," she said, "if someone you love is doing something wrong, are you supposed to tell?" I looked up from the worksheet. "That depends," I said. "What kind of wrong?" She thought about it. "Like saying things that aren't true." "Do you mean lying?" She nodded slowly. "What if telling makes things harder? Does that mean you shouldn't?" I put the worksheet down. I asked her gently if something was happening at school, if there was a problem with a friend. She shook her head. "Just wondering," she said. "It was for a story." I let it go. Kids ask abstract questions. They process things through hypotheticals. I made a mental note to check in with her teacher, and then the week got busy, and I didn't. I have thought about that conversation many times since. Carol's changes continued. She started going to bed earlier, or going to the guest room earlier, which had started as a sleep thing. She said she wasn't sleeping well and didn't want to wake me. I offered to see a doctor with her, suggested a sleep study. She said it would pass. It didn't pass. After about 6 weeks, the guest room had quietly become her room, and I had stopped mentioning it because every time I did she would get a particular look on her face, a kind of patient exhaustion, like I was the one making things complicated by noticing. The boutique had always given us a natural reason for Carol to be out of the house. Shop hours, vendor meetings, buying trips. I'd never tracked her schedule. That wasn't who I was in the marriage. I trusted her and she trusted me, or I thought she did, and we both moved through our days with a reasonable amount of independence. Looking back now, I can see how that independence became something she used. In the courtroom, Carol's attorney was wrapping up his opening statements. He was thorough and practiced. He spoke about Carol as a woman who had sacrificed her own professional ambitions to support the household, who had prioritized Lily's stability above everything, who had asked for help from her husband and been consistently disappointed. Paul, my attorney, made his objections where it was appropriate. But the story Carol's side was telling was coherent and detailed and delivered with confidence. I could feel it settling over the room like something being formally decided. And then I looked over at Lily. She had her hand on her backpack, not opening it, just resting her hand on the top of it the way you hold something you're not ready to use yet. She caught me looking. She didn't smile. She just held my eyes for a moment, and then she looked back at her hands. Something about the steadiness in her face made me go very still inside. I didn't know yet what she had in that bag, but I knew, right then, that my daughter was waiting for something. and that she had a plan. Carol took the stand mid-morning. She walked up to the witness chair the way she walked into most rooms, composed, chin slightly raised, like someone who had already decided how things were going to go. She smoothed her jacket before she sat down. She placed her hands in her lap. She looked at her attorney and gave him a small nod that said she was ready. I watched her and tried to find the woman I'd married in there somewhere. The one who used to fall asleep on the couch reading, who made terrible coffee and knew it and laughed about it, who had cried in the hospital parking lot the night Lily was born because she said she didn't know it was possible to feel that much at once. That woman wasn't in the witness chair. Or if she was very far underneath whatever Carol had become in the past year. Her attorney walked her through it carefully. He asked about the early years of the marriage, the decision to open the boutique, the way she had structured her professional life around Lily's needs. Carol answered everything in a calm, measured voice. She was good at this. She had always been good at presenting herself. When the questions moved toward me, toward my role as a husband and father, her tone shifted only slightly. She didn't attack. She spoke with what sounded like reluctant honesty, the way someone talks when they've been forced to admit something they'd rather protect. She said I was a provider, but not a partner. She said I showed up physically, but was rarely present in any way that mattered to Lily or to her. She mentioned specific incidents: the concert I missed, the parent-teacher meeting, a birthday dinner where she said I'd spent most of it on my phone dealing with a work issue. Some of it was accurate. I won't pretend otherwise. I had missed things. I had been distracted at times. That was real. But the frame she put around it, the implication that this was the whole of who I was, that Lily had grown up essentially without a father while I was in the same house, that was not real. And I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not react, because Paul had been clear with me about that, and because I had learned over the course of my life that the most effective thing you can do when someone is misrepresenting you is to stay very quiet and let them finish. Carol's attorney asked her about Lily's emotional state. Carol paused, and her expression shifted into something softer, and she said that Lily had become withdrawn over the past couple of years, that she'd had trouble in school, that she'd asked Carol more than once why Daddy was never home. I looked at Lily when Carol said that. Lily was looking at her mother, not with the expression of a child hearing something hard and true, with the expression of a child listening very carefully to something she knows isn't right. Her jaw was set. Her hands were still on her backpack. Paul leaned over to me and said quietly that he would address the characterizations during cross-examination. I nodded. I was watching Lily. Then Lily raised her hand. Not tentatively. Not like a child who isn't sure if she's allowed. She raised it the way she raised it in class when she knew the answer and wanted to be called on. Straight up, elbow locked, patient. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Wynn, noticed it immediately. She had one of those faces that's been trained over decades to stay neutral, but I saw her eyes move to Lily, and something in them softened just slightly. "Young lady," Judge Wynn said, gently, the way you speak to a child in a room full of adults. "Did you want to say something?" Carol's attorney started to rise. Judge Wynn held up one hand without looking at him, and he sat back down. Lily stood up from her seat. She was small. She's always been small for her age, but she stood up straight, and she spoke clearly. "Your Honor," she said, "I have something I'd like to show you. It's on my tablet. My dad doesn't know about it." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people being respectful. The specific, hell-breath quiet of a room where something unexpected has just happened and everyone is waiting to understand what it means. Carol had stopped speaking mid-sentence. She was looking at Lily with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. It wasn't anger yet. It was the first stage before anger. Recognition. The sudden understanding that something she thought she controlled had moved outside her control. Judge Wynn looked at Lily for a moment. Then she said, "Come up here, sweetheart. Tell me your name." Lily picked up her backpack and walked to the front of the courtroom. She was calm. She walked the way she walks when she's decided something, that particular straightness she gets in her spine. "My name is Lily," she said. "I'm 8 years old. I live with my mom and my dad, but right now my mom wants the judge to say I can only live with her. And I need you to see something before you decide that, because my mom has been saying things about my dad that aren't true." Carol's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, with respect, the child hasn't been designated as a witness. Anything she presents here would be." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Wynn said. Not loudly, Just finally. He sat down. The judge looked at Lily. What do you have to show me? Lily unzipped her backpack and took out her tablet. She held it with both hands. I made some videos, she said, over the last few months. Because I kept hearing my mom say things about my dad when he wasn't in the room, and they didn't match what I actually saw. So I started writing things down first, and then I figured out how to record. She looked up at the judge. I have 14 videos. I think you should see them. Paul put his hand on my arm. I think he was making sure I stayed in my chair, because the floor had just shifted under everything. Carol, still in the witness chair, had gone a specific shade of pale that I recognized. It was the color her face went when something had moved past the point where she could manage it. Her attorney was whispering to his assistant. I could see the words damage and inadmissible and context being shaped by his mouth without sound. Judge Wynn said, "Show me." Lily tapped the screen twice, turned the tablet toward the judge, and pressed play. And the room went completely still. The first recording was 43 seconds long. I know that because Judge Wynn watched it twice, and the second time I counted. The audio was clear, clearer than I would have expected from a child recording on a tablet through a partially open door. You could hear the ambient sound of the house underneath it, the refrigerator hum, a car passing outside, and then Carol's voice, low and deliberate, speaking to someone on the phone. She said, "He doesn't know anything. He goes to work, he comes home, he thinks everything is fine. That's who Gerald is. He needs everything to be fine, so he decides it is." A pause. The other voice wasn't audible. Then Carol again. "The attorney says if I establish the pattern now, the absences, the emotional unavailability, it builds the foundation. It needs to be consistent. Every conversation with Lily, every interaction, it all needs to support the same picture." Another pause. "I know it takes time, but I've been doing this for 6 months already. I know how to be patient." Judge Wynn stopped the playback. She looked at Carol in the witness chair. Carol was sitting very still in the way people sit when they are deciding, very quickly, what their face should be doing. "Mrs. Alderman," the judge said, "is that your voice on this recording?" Carol's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, I'd ask that we have an opportunity to review the provenance of these recordings before. I'm asking your client a direct question, counselor." A silence. Carol said, "Those are private conversations, taken out of context by a child who doesn't understand what she was hearing." "That's not what I asked," Judge Wynn said. "Is that your voice?" Carol said nothing. The judge looked at Lily. "How many videos did you say you have?" 14, Lily said. "But some of them are short, and 3 of them have the same person's voice on them. A man. Mom calls him Ray." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I hadn't heard that name before. I want to be clear about that. I had no idea, sitting in that courtroom, who Ray was. I would find out later. But in that moment, the name meant only one thing to me. There was a person in my marriage I hadn't known about, and my 8-year-old daughter had known about him for months. Lily pulled up the second recording without being asked. She looked at the judge first, checking, and Judge Wynn nodded once. This one was longer, maybe 2 minutes. It had been recorded in what I recognized as our kitchen. I could hear the particular sound our back door makes when it's open in cool weather, that faint pressure hum. Carol's voice was more relaxed in this one, less guarded. She was talking to someone in the room with her, not on the phone. She said, "The boutique accounts are separate. Hall, Gerald's attorney. He won't know to look there unless someone tells him. And no one's going to tell him." The man's voice, Ray, said something I couldn't fully make out. Something about timing. Carol said, "After the settlement. Once the support is established and the house transfers, then we figure out the next part. One thing at a time." Ray said something again, this time clearer. "And you're not worried about Lily?" Carol said, "Lily will be fine. Kids adjust. She'll be in a stable home with me. She'll have structure, and Gerald can have his weekends. That's more than a lot of kids get." Ray said, "He's not going to just accept every other weekend." Carol said, "He won't have a choice. That's why the narrative has to be solid before we walk into that courtroom. It's not about what's true. It's about what the record shows." Lily stopped the playback herself. She looked at the judge and said, simply, "She practiced saying things about my dad. She told me what to say too, if anyone asked me questions." Judge Wynn set her pen down. She looked at Carol for a long moment. Then she called for a 30-minute recess and asked both attorneys to her chambers along with a court-appointed child advocate who had been sitting quietly at the side of the room. She asked the bailiff to make sure Lily was comfortable and had water. Before she stood, she looked at my daughter and said, "You did something very difficult today. I want you to know I take it seriously." Lily nodded. She sat back down next to me and put her tablet carefully in her lap. The courtroom emptied around us. Carol was guided out by her attorney, their conversation immediate and urgent, his hand on her elbow the way you steer someone who needs steering. She didn't look back at Lily. She didn't look at me. I sat with my daughter in the row of hard wooden seats, and I didn't say anything for a minute. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't be too much. Lily leaned against my arm, not dramatically, just the easy lean of a tired child, and stared at the front of the room. "Dad," she said finally. "Yeah, I didn't want to have to do this. I know." I tried to think of another way. I put my arm around her. "How long have you been carrying this?" She thought about it. "Since March," she said. That's when I heard the first thing that didn't make sense. I didn't record it because I didn't know I should yet. I just wrote it down in my notebook. Then I heard another one a week later, and I wrote that down too. And then one night Mom was on the phone, and I had the tablet, and I pressed the button. March was 8 months ago. My daughter had been sitting with this for 8 months. Paul came back into the courtroom briefly to tell me that the judge had requested a full copy of the recordings be transferred to the court's record, and that both attorneys had been instructed to prepare responses to the new information before proceedings resumed. He said his tone had shifted, I could hear it, and that the situation was no longer what it had been 2 hours ago. I asked him what he thought would happen. He said, "I think the story they came in here to tell is over." He went back to chambers. I sat with Lily. Outside the tall windows of the courtroom, I could see the top of a parking structure and a gray November sky. Pigeons moving along a ledge. Ordinary things. I thought about March. I thought about the evening I'd come home from Michigan and Carol had been on the phone in the kitchen. I thought about Lily at the homework table asking me whether telling the truth was worth it if it made things harder. She had already known then. She'd been trying to figure out what to do. I had handed her back a worksheet about a story problem and told her to get some sleep. She had gone upstairs and opened a notebook and written down what she'd heard because she didn't know what else to do with it, and she wasn't ready to come to me yet. And she was 8 years old, and she was trying to figure it out on her own. I don't have a word for what that feels like, to understand that about your child. I'm not sure there is one. The recess ran long. 45 minutes, then an hour. Lily ate a granola bar from her backpack and read a book she'd brought. She was calm in the specific way she gets when she's done something hard and is now on the other side of it, waiting for the world to catch up. I watched the door to the judge's chambers. Whatever was happening in that room, I knew when those doors opened, everything in the courtroom would be arranged differently than it had been when we walked in. I put my hand over Lily's and we waited. The doors to the judge's chambers opened at 11:47. I know because I had been watching the clock on the wall across from us. One of those large institutional clocks with a plain white face and a second hand that moves in small, deliberate ticks. I had been watching it the way you watch something when you need to put your attention somewhere that won't cost you anything. Paul came in first. He walked directly to me, sat down, and opened his notepad. "The judge has reviewed 6 of the 14 recordings," he said quietly. "She's seen enough to restructure the entire proceeding. We're filing a counterpetition for primary custody, dismissal of the spousal support claim, and a full audit of the boutique financials based on what was said in the second recording." I asked him about the boutique specifically. What had Carol meant when she said the accounts were separate and that no one would know to look there? Paul said that was exactly what the financial audit would determine, that it was possible Carol had been managing money in ways that didn't appear in the shared financial disclosures both sides had submitted at the start of the process. If that was true, it wasn't just a divorce issue. It was a separate legal matter. He said, "Let the process work. That's all you need to do right now." I nodded. That was something I could manage. Carol came back in with her attorney a few minutes later. The change in her posture was visible from across the room. She had walked into that courtroom in the morning with a particular kind of confidence, not loud, but settled, the confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. That was gone now. She sat down and kept her eyes forward and did not look at Lily or at me. Her attorney had the look of a man recalculating. Judge Wynn came in and everyone stood and then sat, and the room rearranged itself into session. The judge set her notes on the bench and looked at Carol directly. "Mrs. Alderman," she said, I've spent the last hour reviewing recordings made by your daughter over a period of approximately 8 months. I want to give you an opportunity to speak to what's on those recordings before I address the court. Specifically, I want to give you the chance to explain, in your own words, the conversation in which you stated, and I'm reading directly from my notes here, that the divorce proceedings were not about what was true, but about what the record showed. Carol's attorney leaned toward her. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. Then Carol straightened in her seat and said, "Your Honor, I understand how those words sound out of context. I was venting to a friend. I was stressed and frustrated, and I said things I didn't mean the way they came out. The recordings are fragments. A child was recording private conversations without understanding what she was hearing, and those fragments are being treated as Mrs. Alderman," the judge said. Carol stopped. "Your daughter is 8 years old. She didn't record these conversations because she misunderstood them. She recorded them because she understood them well enough to recognize that something wasn't right. That's a meaningful distinction." Carol said nothing. Judge Wynn turned to her notes again. "In the recordings reviewed so far, I've identified 3 separate conversations in which you discussed the deliberate construction of a false narrative about your husband's parenting. I've identified 1 conversation in which you reference keeping financial accounts separate from discovery. And I've identified 2 conversations with an individual named Ray in which you discuss the desired outcome of these proceedings in terms that suggest the welfare of your daughter was a secondary consideration to the financial settlement." She paused. "These are not fragments. They are a pattern." Carol's attorney stood. His voice was measured, professionally steady, but underneath it something had tightened. "Your Honor, we would ask that the admissibility of these recordings be fully evaluated before they're treated as evidentiary. A child recording a parent in a private home raises significant questions about." "I'm aware of the legal questions, Counselor. They will be addressed. But I want to be clear about something." Judge Wynn looked at him without any particular expression. "The admissibility question does not change what I heard. And what I heard will inform every decision I make in this courtroom going forward, whether or not those recordings are formally entered into evidence." He sat down. Paul stood up and presented the counterpetition formally. "Primary custody of Lily to be awarded to me on a temporary emergency basis pending full evaluation. Dismissal of Carol's spousal support claim based on documented evidence of fraud and misrepresentation in the proceedings. Request for a full forensic audit of the boutique's financial records for the preceding 24 months." As Paul spoke, I watched Carol. She was holding herself together. I could see the effort of it. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, very still, the way you hold your hands when you're concentrating on not letting them move. Her jaw was set. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere above the judge's head. Then Paul finished, and Judge Wynn began outlining her preliminary decisions, and something in Carol finally broke through. Not loudly, not the way it happens in films, with shouting and dramatic declarations. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to watch. She turned toward Lily. Her voice was low, controlled, but with something sharp underneath it that she wasn't managing anymore. "Do you understand what you've done?" she said. "Everything I planned, everything I worked for, you've handed it all to him. Do you understand that?" Lily looked at her mother. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She looked at Carol with the same steady, careful expression she'd had all morning, and she said, quietly, "I told the truth, Mom." Carol's face did something complicated that I don't have a clean word for. It was somewhere between grief and rage and the specific look of a person who has been caught not just in a lie, but in a version of themselves they didn't intend to show. Judge Wynn said, "Mrs. Alderman, that's enough." Carol's attorney put his hand on her arm. Carol looked away from Lily. She looked down at the table. And then, slowly, whatever she'd been holding together seemed to go out of her, and she just sat there, diminished somehow, smaller than she'd been when she walked in. The judge addressed the courtroom. "Effective immediately, I'm granting temporary primary custody of Lily Alderman to her father, Gerald Alderman. Mrs. Alderman will be permitted supervised visitation, the terms of which will be established following a full custody evaluation. Given the content of the recordings and Mrs. Alderman's conduct in this courtroom today, I have significant concerns about the child's exposure to continued manipulation, and those concerns will be reflected in the evaluation criteria." She turned to Carol's attorney. "The spousal support petition is suspended pending the financial audit. I'm also referring the boutique account discrepancy to the court's Financial Oversight Office. If the audit reveals discrepancies between what was disclosed and what was actually held, that will carry its own consequences separate from these proceedings. She set her pen down. Mr. Alderman, she said, looking at me, your daughter showed a great deal of courage today. She also showed a great deal of loyalty to you and to the truth. Those are not small things. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice enough to say anything. Paul put a hand briefly on my shoulder and then began gathering his papers. Across the room, Carol was being guided toward the door by her attorney, who was already speaking quietly into his phone. She didn't look back. She walked out of the courtroom the way water moves when a drain opens, quickly and without resistance, like the room had simply stopped being something she could stand in. Lily sat next to me. She put her tablet back in her bag, carefully, zipping it all the way closed. Then she sat up straight and looked at the front of the room and let out a long, slow breath. I reached over and took her hand. She held on. We sat like that while the courtroom emptied around us, until it was just the two of us in the quiet, in the hard wooden chairs, with the clock on the wall ticking its small and steady ticks. The financial audit took 11 weeks. I know because Paul called me on a Thursday morning in late January to tell me it was complete, and I remember standing in the kitchen counting back through the weeks to that Tuesday in November, the courthouse smell, the clock on the wall, Lily's hand in mine. 11 weeks is not a long time when you're building something. It feels longer when you're waiting for an accounting of how much of your life someone else had been quietly redirecting. The audit found what the recordings had suggested it would find. Carol had been running a secondary set of accounts through the boutique for approximately 19 months. Not large transfers, nothing that would have flagged immediately. Small, regular movements. Vendor payments to companies that, when the auditors traced them, turned out to be registered to a holding entity that listed Ray as a director. His full name was Raymond Coates. He was 44 years old. He had met Carol at a trade event for independent retail businesses about 2 years before she filed for divorce. The auditors found correspondence going back 21 months. The money wasn't enormous in the way people sometimes imagine these things. It wasn't millions. It was, in total, a little over $60,000 moved across that period. But the boutique had two other investors, a silent partner and Carol's cousin, who had each put money in when the business opened. The money Carol had redirected had come partly from the business's operating accounts, which meant it wasn't only my money she had been managing without authorization. Her former business partners filed a civil claim within a week of the audit results. That became its own proceeding, separate from the divorce, with its own timeline and its own attorneys. Raymond Coates, from what Paul was able to determine, had already relocated by the time the audit concluded. He had left the state sometime in December, around the time Carol's legal situation became clear. His name was removed from the holding entity's registration shortly after. Paul said this was not uncommon. He said it with the neutral tone of a man who has seen this particular shape of things before. Carol's spousal support claim was formally dismissed in early February. The property division was restructured based on the corrected financial picture. The house stayed with Lily and me. Carol received a portion of the proceeds from the boutique's dissolution. The business had closed in December, the inventory liquidated, but after the restitution owed to her business partners was factored in, what remained was modest. She did not fight the custody evaluation. I think by that point she understood that fighting it would only extend a process that was not going in her favor, and that the evaluation itself, given everything that was on record, was unlikely to produce a different result than what Judge Wynn had already set in motion. The evaluator was a woman named Dr. Frances Okafor. She met with Lily 4 times over 6 weeks. She met with me twice. She reviewed the court record, the recordings, and the documentation from Lily's school and pediatrician. She also met with Carol once, though Carol's participation was, according to Dr. Okafor's written report, limited. The report was thorough and careful in the way these documents have to be. It didn't editorialize. It described what it observed. But its conclusions were clear. Lily's primary residence should remain with her father. Carol's access should continue under supervised conditions until a period of demonstrated stability could be established. The report noted that Lily had shown, quote, a well-developed sense of moral reasoning and a strong attachment to her father that had been sustained despite significant pressure to the contrary. I read that line 3 times when Paul sent me the report. I thought about Lily at the homework table in March, asking me whether telling the truth was worth it when it made things harder. I thought about her writing things down in a notebook, alone in her room, before she knew what she was going to do with any of it. I thought about her walking to the front of that courtroom with her backpack and her tablet and that straight, decided spine. Well-developed sense of moral reasoning. She was 8 years old. The final divorce decree came through on a Friday in early March. Paul brought it to the house rather than mailing it. I think he understood that this was not a document I wanted to open alone in an empty hallway. We sat at the kitchen table and he walked me through it. Lily was at school. The decree confirmed primary physical and legal custody with me. Carol retained the right to request supervised visitation, scheduled through a family services coordinator. It noted that Lily, upon reaching an appropriate age, could make her own decisions about contact. Paul set the papers on the table, and we sat for a moment without talking. "It's done," he said. I nodded. He asked how I was. I said I wasn't entirely sure yet. He said that was a reasonable answer. He drank the rest of his coffee, gathered his copies, and let himself out. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after he left. The house was quiet. Outside the window, the yard was still winter bare, the oak tree at the back fence just beginning to show the earliest suggestion of buds along its branches. Not open yet, just the first indication of what was coming. I thought about the $60,000, about 19 months of small redirections that I hadn't known to look for. I thought about Raymond Coates and his holding company and how efficiently he had disappeared. I thought about Carol's voice on Lily's recordings, calm and methodical, discussing the narrative that needed to be consistent, the record that needed to support a particular picture. I thought about how long I had lived inside that picture without knowing I was in it. And then I thought about something else, something smaller. About 4 months before Carol filed for divorce, Lily and I had spent a Saturday afternoon raking leaves in the backyard. Carol had been out, a buying trip, she'd said. Lily and I had raked the leaves into a large pile near the fence, and then Lily had jumped into it approximately 11 times. And each time she landed, she looked up at me with that specific expression children have when they're experiencing uncomplicated joy and want to confirm that the person they love most is watching. I had been watching. I had been there. Whatever Carol had been constructing, whatever record she had been building, that afternoon had happened. It was real. No audit could touch it, and no courtroom could revise it, and no narrative could reach back into that Saturday and remove the two of us from the yard with the leaf pile and the cold autumn light. There were hundreds of those moments, probably thousands. They existed independent of what anyone said about them. I think that was the thing that finally settled something in me. Sitting at that kitchen table with the decree in front of me and the oak tree outside and the house quiet around me. The truth doesn't require anyone's permission to be true. I stacked the papers neatly and put them in the folder Paul had left. Then I went to the cabinet and got out the flour and the baking soda and the brown sugar, because Lily would be home in 2 hours and Fridays were the day we made something. And this Friday felt like it should be no different. I measured everything out carefully and set it on the counter in order, the way I always do. And then I waited for my daughter to come home. 6 months after that Friday, the oak tree in the backyard was full. I mean that simply. The branches that had been bare in March were dense with leaves by September, the way they get at the end of summer when the season has fully committed to itself. Lily had hung a small wind chime from the lowest branch in July, a craft project from her summer program, painted ceramic discs on a knotted string, and on quiet mornings I could hear it from the kitchen window while I made breakfast. That was the sound the house had now, small and intermittent and easy. We had found a rhythm, Lily and I, the way two people do when they've been through something large together and come out the other side still intact. It wasn't the rhythm I'd had before. It was different, built from scratch, calibrated to just the two of us, but it was ours, and it held. I had renegotiated my schedule at work. 3 days in the office, 2 from home. My manager had been more accommodating than I expected. I think the situation, in broad strokes, had become known at work the way things do in offices, and people have been quietly decent about it in the way people sometimes are when they don't know what to say but want to do something. Mornings were mine and Lily's. Breakfast together, always. She'd started setting the table without being asked, putting out the glasses in the napkins with the particular seriousness she brought to things she'd decided mattered. Evenings we ate dinner together, and she told me about her day in the unhurried, detailed way children talk when they feel genuinely listened to. About her friends, her teacher, a disagreement on the playground that she had resolved by suggesting a fair system for taking turns, which her teacher had apparently adopted for the whole class. I had listened to that story and thought, not for the first time, she's going to be fine. She's more than fine. Dr. Okafor had recommended a therapist for Lily as a follow-up to the custody evaluation, a man named Dr. Elliot Webb who specialized in children navigating family transitions. Lily had seen him every other week since April. She liked him, she said, because he didn't talk to her like she was fragile. She said he talked to her like she was someone who had handled something hard and was now figuring out what came next, which was, she said, accurate. I had my own appointments too, with a therapist I'd started seeing in January, a woman named Dr. Anita Brown who had a small office above a pharmacy on the east side of Columbus. I had gone initially because Paul suggested it, and I trusted Paul's judgment. I had continued because it turned out there was more to sort through than I had initially accounted for. Not just the anger, though there was some of that. More the slower work of understanding how I had moved through 16 years of marriage without seeing certain things clearly. Not because I was foolish, but because I had trusted in a way that didn't leave room for doubt, and trusting that completely turns out to have its own costs. Dr. Brown had said once, during one of our early sessions, trusting someone isn't a mistake. What you're learning is just how to keep your own eyes open at the same time. I had written that down afterward. I kept it on a note card in my desk drawer. Carol had not made contact since December. Her attorney had communicated that she was living with a relative in another state and was in the process of stabilizing her situation. The supervised visitation she was entitled to request had not been requested. Lily had not asked about her in some time. I did not fill that silence with explanations or commentary. When Lily asked questions, I answered them honestly and proportionally, which is to say I told her the truth without giving her more than she needed to carry at any given age. She was 8. Then she was 9, in August, when we had a small birthday party in the backyard with 4 friends from school and a cake Lily had chosen herself, lemon, with yellow frosting, and the wind chime moved in the late summer air and the afternoon was entirely ordinary in the best possible way. I had taken a photograph of her at the table with the cake and her friends. She was laughing at something one of them had said, her head tilted back, completely unself-conscious. I kept it on my phone in the way you keep certain photographs, not because you need to look at them often, but because you want to know they're there. The boutique space on Clement Street had been leased to a new tenant by autumn, a man who ran a small framing and print shop. I had walked past it once in September, not deliberately, just the ordinary route of an errand, and I had looked at the new sign in the window and felt almost nothing, which I recognized as a form of progress. Some evenings after Lily was in bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and go over whatever needed doing, bills, scheduling, work emails, the ordinary administrative layer of a life. It was quiet in the specific way that the house had learned to be, a quiet that was no longer loaded with things being unsaid. I had stopped dreading the quiet. That had taken a while, but it had happened. I think about something Dr. Brown said about 8 weeks into our sessions. She said that the end of a deception is often the beginning of something that's actually real. That the painful part isn't just what you lose. It's also what you finally get to see clearly. The people who are actually there. The life that's actually yours. I understood that more as the months went on. I had a colleague at work, a man named Thomas, who had been through a difficult divorce some years before I met him. He'd mentioned it once, briefly, in the context of something else, and I hadn't thought much of it at the time. But a few weeks after the final decree came through, he stopped by my office with a question about a project and then stood in the doorway for a moment and said, carefully, I heard things got resolved. I'm glad. I thanked him. He nodded and started to leave and then turned back and said, if you ever want to talk to someone who came out the other side, I'm around. Then he went back to his desk. I hadn't taken him up on it yet, but I had been thinking about it. Because he had 2 kids of his own, shared custody, a life that had been rebuilt from a difficult place into something that appeared to be genuinely good. And lately he'd been mentioning in passing a situation with his sister, something about a long marriage and a husband who had become someone she didn't recognize, some kind of financial deception that had been going on for years, and she didn't yet know what to do with what she'd found. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my place. But I thought about it on the drive home that evening. the particular weight of finding out that the life you thought you were living had a different shape than you understood. If she needed to talk to someone who had been through something similar, I thought Thomas might eventually point her in a useful direction. And if she needed someone with more specific experience, there were people for that too. Processes, documents, steps that could be taken one at a time in the right order. The truth, it turns out, has a way of organizing things. It doesn't always move quickly, but it moves. On a Saturday morning in late September, I made pancakes. Lily sat at the kitchen table with her sketchbook, working on something she wouldn't show me yet because, she said, it wasn't finished. The light came in through the east window the way it does in autumn mornings, low and specific, making the ordinary things in the room look considered. The ceramic fruit bowl on the counter, the wind chime visible through the glass of the back door, the stack of library books on the chair by the wall that we kept meaning to return and kept not returning because there was always one more chapter. I set a plate in front of her, and she looked up from her sketchbook and said thank you and looked back down. I sat across from her with my coffee and watched the morning do what mornings do. There wasn't anything else required of me in that moment. I didn't need to manage anything or prepare for anything or hold anything together through effort. I just needed to be there, which I was, which I intended to keep being, for as long as she needed me to be. That was the whole of it. That was enough. If any part of this story stayed with you, I'd be glad if you hit the like button and subscribed. This channel is built on stories like this one, quiet, true, and worth hearing all the way through. Leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read them. It matters to me to know how far these stories reach. Next, you'll find two stories that have been getting a lot of attention lately. One is about a man who discovered something in his father's estate that changed everything he thought he knew about his family. The other is about a woman who stayed silent for 3 years and then, in a single afternoon, changed the outcome of something that had seemed decided. Both are worth your time. Thank you for listening.